Tell me if you've heard this before. You're too volatile of an individual for a company, for a business, for a corporation to back you financially in some way. Tell me if you've heard many individuals before describing, explaining away an excuse for a company enacting disciplinary measures, economic disciplinary measures upon an individual described as too volatile to support financially. This happens for advertising, sponsorships, donors. Go down the list. You are ethically wrong and problematic for this company to back you, support you. They should stop supporting you, and they should go out of their way to make sure that you are no longer to be supported ever again in the future. We've heard these explanations and these excuses by the moralists before. The leftists, they have often and quite frequently, commonly, made these excuses. It's so interesting that you see them run so much cover fire for excusing a company, excusing a business, in doing everything in its power to silence people and to ultimately enforce their ethics, their principles, their morality onto both their customers and their workers. It's very interesting that when you look at this, for instance, it's very interesting, and let's mention this first and foremost. Is the left, who specifically care the most for the separation, they're the ones most obsessed with the discussion on the separation of church and state. Yet so interestingly, they will make excuses for companies as if those companies are our moral authorities. That's so strange. It's so strange how they will sit there and say, well, you see, the reason why that these companies, they do these disciplinary measures, it's because you're such a bad individual. You're so naughty. Don't be naughty. Therefore, the company would not have to go after you. And they'll make these excuses, really pandering to the ethics of these companies, as if these companies, again, are the moral authority. Well, that's so strange that you would give all of this moral authority to a company when, for one, they're deserving of none such authority. And they, for one, you are to be a sovereign individual, but for some reason you're choosing that these companies should be sovereign over you. You're giving them all this moral authority that they can just sit here and predilect onto you what your ethics ought to be, how you ought to go about life, go through the world, how you ought to see things. And that if you do not align with the company, then they revoke their business from you. It's quite interesting because for the longest time, again, liberals, they always had the issue with the separation of church and state, the fact that the church and the state were in bed with one another. They didn't like that, especially when it came down to economy, when it came down to culture. But then it's so strange that once they killed religion and once they separated church and state, it's so interesting that the liberals, and of course that's a deeper conversation, you could say, obviously you have conservatives who have recognized a potential issue with this and that perhaps there should be a separation. That's a different conversation though. Who gives a freaking crap? Because what we're talking about today, because it's really the left. They're the ones who obsess over church and state the most. And they get off on the idea of putting people, specifically Christians, into a little corner of the world that no one pays attention to because they want to outcast Christianity. We all know this. So interesting, however, that you have these liberals who give moral authority to these companies and corporations, much like a church. And that in fact, they give so much authority to these corporations and companies, just like a time where church and state is not separated. It's so fascinating when you watch these leftists. They go out of their way to treat modern corporations and companies exactly like a church or some sort of religious institution. It's so strange that modern companies now have, and they're being granted, and they're being granted culturally, but also economically, the authority of a church. Of a church with absolute authority, of course, that they're in bed with the government, the state. It's so strange that we've ended up here. When once before it was so wrong, when we sat there and we were like, that's so weird and that's wrong. The church should not be in bed with the state. The church should not be in bed with the government. No, religion should not inform and reiterate what the government ought to do and the government back onto the church. They should be separated from each other, right? So many people spoke about this. And the left, of course, the leftists, they tuned on and on about how this is wrong, this is evil, and we must separate the two. We must give freedom to those who are not Christian, right? To all those hedonists, we must give them their freedom. This is what we did for the longest time, is that we moralized and we vilified faith, Christianity specifically, religion as a whole, but they don't like Catholicism or Protestantism, Christianity. They don't like that at all. They don't like the Bible. So interesting, however, for the longest time we sat there and we said that the church, right? We understood culturally that they have a lot of say about your ethics, about morality, that they have a lot of say about how we conduct ourselves, what's right and what's wrong, right? We said this for a long time, for many generations. Suddenly we said that was evil and that should be completely cast aside and then exiled. Nowadays, we've now given the same authority over to these companies. It's very strange how we did that. It's very strange how no one wants to have any problem with it. It's very strange how nobody wants to demonize it. Nobody wants to question it and ask for possibly reform. Nobody wants to do anything because, in fact, it's just normal, bro. What's wrong, bro? This is just common ethics, bro. This is how you ought to conduct yourself. This is the way that things are meant to be. One of the number one things that you will notice about a leftist is that you cannot question their ethics. Their ethics are God. Their ethics is normality. Their ethics is common sense. This is how they treat their values, their beliefs. You can't question them, and if you do, there's something wrong with you. We all know this. They speak this way quite often and most of the time. It's so strange that they would cast aside religion, that they would demonize the church, only to spring up their own church, their own religion. Of course, what is the religion of these companies? It's egalitarianism. And of course, through egalitarianism, they push and they push, they fight for, they conquest, and they take over one mind, one region after another. And this is a war philosophy, do not forget. But they will go out of their way. They will go out of their way to enforce their political will and their modern day religion. They have their propagandists, who are the evangelists of these propaganda wings, who, by the way, are in bed. These companies, they're in bed with the government, we all know, through ESG, and many other branches of ESG, we all know. We all know how right now these companies, these corporations, are literally in lockstep with the government. But for some reason, no one wants to call this out. For some reason, there's to be no separation of a company, a corporation that's playing activists, that's playing politics. There's no separation that ought to be instituted within the economy, which is therein also the culture, because they want to dictate upon you whether or not you live, you breathe, you house yourself, you clothe yourself, your economical life, which effectively they want to turn you into non-citizens, but that your economical life should be completely predicated upon a company, a business, a corporation, and whether or not it supports your politics. That's how these clowns now want to facilitate your life and the country. And, of course, the economy. And whether or not you're allowed to make your own dollar, your own cent off of your own labors. Only a leftist is allowed such a thing because they are in line with the company's politics. They're in line with the modern day church. So you do not end up being excommunicated. That's what we've done. So it's quite interesting that we do this. It's quite interesting how people want to moralize everything. And don't you love moralists? Don't you love people who go on all day? They drone on and on about what's moral, what's immoral. They love to talk about morality. No one ever reveals to you the reality, however, that it's not about morality. It's not about good and evil. It's about who are you moralizing for? Moralize for the native national of your country, someone of your fellow ancestry, or moralize for a foreigner who is invading your country. Who should we moralize for? Moralize for the law-abiding citizen, or moralize for a criminal? And now we've seen through egalitarianism who these people decide to affiliate with and who they decide to post up with. Who do they choose to support? Who do they choose to excuse? Who do they choose to incriminate? We've seen this time and time again, many times before. It's quite interesting. What's so fascinating about all of this is how we rid ourselves of religion just to remove that religious institution and place in a new materialistic institution that happens to be a religious institution. It's so interesting that we have a problem with faith and God and reason only to really reveal ourselves, to prove what we are and state. It's really not your religion and religion in general that's an issue. It's the fact that you are rivaling my religion. That's the issue. And that we want to take over your culture. Yes, you're a Christian, and that's wrong. What you should be is an egalitarian. That's what you should be, and now that's what many people are, including modern-day Christians, because now they've weaponized the New Testament, they've weaponized Christianity, and now modern-day Christianity, by the way, is egalitarianism. It's something very different from what it once was, especially from the rootings of what Christianity was. During the fall of Rome, and of course after that, the Holy Roman Empire, going on and on from there. And of course, by the way, the first universities came from Christianity, Catholicism, Protestantism, came from these things. It's so interesting that nowadays our modern companies are now just expressions of the state. And that so many leftists and so many people, they just allow it to happen and they don't see any problem with it. In fact, they're quite accepting of it. But that's quite interesting because I thought we all said that this was a problem. So now you notice that a lot of people, they'll run a lot of cover fire for the ethics of these companies, these corporations, and that they're supposed to dictate to you what is right and wrong. So we look at issues like the LGBT mafia and their freaking problems, and let's just face it, it's the insane asylum mafia, the LGBT, and you're supposed to back them, you're supposed to support them. They're in bed with the government which, by the way, is forcing this upon you. And by the way, interestingly enough, I want to ask you something. This is very interesting, right? A business, a corporation, and a company, their main concern with you is whether or not they make profit. It does not matter if someone that is the Neo of the 1930s Germany guys, or if they're a member of KKK. Does not matter. What matters for a business is if you have a message to speak or whatever, you have people who are listening to you through whatever medium it is, television, whatever else. It does not matter what your message is, unless, it was actual criminality, but no one actually gives a crap about actual criminality. So again, let's stay on point here. No matter what your message is, as long as you're drawing eyeballs, we just want to put our product in front of potential customers and we want them to purchase our product. That's all that matters for a business. All that matters for a business is where the customer is and whether or not the customer has enough attention for what it is when you run a sponsorship, an advertisement, whether or not they're going to sit around and listen to what it is your message is and what you have to say. Hi there, this is what we are. Will you purchase from us? That's it. That's all that matters. We all know that's all that matters. But so interesting that for some reason now they want to get involved with politics. It's so interesting that they want to silence an entire sect of their customers and say that you are wrong, you are vile, you are evil, and we're going to economically punish you. Economically punish you for not abiding by our politics. Well, that's strange because I thought that in order to live and breathe as a business, you need my dollar, my money, you need me as a customer and other people like me. Why are you completely sectioning off millions of dollars and specifically millions of customers from yourself? Why are you saying that they must be in some way outlawed? If not that, they should be silenced? You're writing off an entire customer base, millions upon millions, tens of millions. I thought we said that there should be a separation of church and state, and yet we treat these businesses, these corporations now, we treat them like a moral authority as if they're a church. And they're in bed. We treat them like a church, and they're in bed with the government. Why is that? And so interesting that they're a business and that it's based on whether or not I purchase their product, I spend money on their product. I thought that's what matters. But in fact, no, they don't care. No. What they do care about is vilifying me, telling me I'm wrong, I'm evil, and that I should be silenced. And that I should be in other ways punished for not aligning to their politics. Well, that's very strange because then that would endanger them as a business. And by the way, they're in... What is business, by the way? When you're in business, what are you in business for? Is it politics? Because nowadays that's what they want to do. Politics and ideology and propaganda. No, when you're in business for profit. So it's very strange that they want to throw away their profit. Where are they getting their money then? How are they continuing to stay afloat? And why are they endangering my dollar? Meanwhile, they're endangering my dollar, telling me that I should be endangered economically. Meanwhile, endangering me should also endanger them. They're a company, they're a business. They're dependent on me, and somehow they're coming after me, targeting me. They're even moralizing to me and telling me what is acceptable or not acceptable about myself and whether or not I should be a citizen or a non-citizen because of how well they accept me and my politics. Where are they getting their money? Because clearly they're coming after me. And clearly they're trying to cancel a lot of people like me. So what is that about? And this is where it comes down to the reality is that when a business, a company, when you are no longer the customer, that means somebody else is. And specifically all throughout history, we know that the second that the citizen is no longer the customer for a business, a corporation, a company, that means that the government is the customer. Where does the government get their money, you ask? Well, throughout history, it's been foreign entities, right? Vassalage. Another country's giving their labor, their tax, basically taxation or whatever it is, they're being embezzled in some way, shape, or form by your country, and then you're getting money from those other foreign entities. And then your people are sovereign economically, right? But we also know that specifically a government ultimately gets its money from the people. How does it get its money from the people? By pointing a gun at your head and saying that if you don't give me your mother effing money, I'm gonna mother effing blast your head off. That's how it works. That's how the government gets its money. So then we sit here. You have these leftards, they sit there and they're like, oh, what a big issue. Church and state, church and state, church and state. Yet you treat businesses, corporations, their ethics like the church. The Church of Egalitarianism, how dare I break your commandments? How dare I break your ethics, your principles? Oh yes, I must bow my knee before the LGBT, before Black Lives Matter, go down the list. Other cultures. Socialism, I should bend my knee before you because you are now God. It's quite interesting that now these companies have become the stand-in for the church, and that now we must bow before them, that we must accept their ethics without question, and that they must endanger us economically, politically, culturally, whatever, and that they must also enforce our politics, our culture, rather than being receptive towards us as the culture and as the politics, and having no say in the matter. But this is what happens when, for any business, and especially for the entirety of the economy, when the citizen is no longer the customer, then that means that the government is the customer. And how does the government afford these businesses their lifeline, right? Their entire lifespan as a whole? How do they afford them their continued existence? That's through taxation. That's the only way. It's the only way that these businesses stay afloat, is by taking money from the working citizen, the laboring citizen, taxing you, and then as through taking your money, embezzling you, they get to push their propaganda. It's always interesting that throughout history, whenever the company is taking your money through the government and the government is giving their money to the company, they're working hand in hand, they're laying in bed with each other. It's very interesting. Then they start pushing propaganda. It's very interesting that they only afford people a lifeline, right? Their way of life, their income. They only afford other people their income. The talking heads, right? The people who are basically the speaking podium, the pulpit, the religious leaders of their movement. The people who support their message, who speak their religious institutions' decree of what is purity, ethical purity, moral purity, political purity, go down the list. It's very interesting that the individuals, the evangelists, who are in lockstep with the state and their church, they're the ones who are allowed to have any business. They're the ones allowed to conduct their labor and not be robbed from in any way. Or, well, you know, because some of them, they get tax breaks and other things, but let's say that doesn't happen, okay? They're just the ones who are allowed to have a citizen existence, while meanwhile you're being treated as the deplorable, you're the evil bigot that must be silenced and censored, and of course, you must be controlled through economical means. That's what they do. It's very interesting how we operate like this, that when a business neglects the customer, that means that they're embracing the government. When they embrace the government, it's so interesting that then it becomes a propaganda wing. It's so interesting that when it becomes a propaganda wing, they always want to fight for and legislate non-citizenry for those who do not conform, and ultimately turn you into an exile, excommunicate you when you did nothing wrong, truly. You're not satanic, you're nothing. You're not in bed with the devil, they are. But that's not the problem for some reason. So when you stand up for your own ethics, you believe in the God, the actual God of the Bible, you need to be a villain of society. And when they support satanic impulse, because ultimately modern day especially, that's what they're supporting, that's what they're fighting for, that's what they're taking your money and pushing as a message. Feminism, go down the list, there's a bunch of things. They push for these things, and these things, by the way, that they push for causes problems upon society. But interestingly enough, you're not allowed to question it. And if you do, they will instrument their designs to punish you. Something to realize is that for the longest time they said that church and state should be separated. This is a big problem. And even after we did it, you have a lot of liberals, they just jerk off to it. There's something about it, they just get off to the fact that for them it's such a big, important issue that church and state are separated. But when they're treating your modern day corporations as a church, They don't have a problem that these huge actors, economical engines, like Disney, for instance, and other companies, they don't have a problem when they are utilizing their economical drivers, their economical force, to reinforce your politics and your cultural values. That's so interesting that for some reason, it's okay for these companies to play God. But that's interesting. You told me that God, or just, okay, man organizing around God, whatever, the church, you said that was wrong. It's so interesting that when you are in contest with their religion, then they want to sit there and they want to tell you, stop making it about politics, stop making it about your faith, your religion. We should be apolitical, a-religious, right? How long did they say all these things? And then they push their religion. Egalitarianism is an absolute religion. You have to be a retard to not see that. Actively, everyone worships many layers and angles of egalitarianism. If you step out of lockstep, you're evil, you're wrong, and you should be cast into the pits of hell. We all know this. This is actually quite common now that we see. Why is this the case? And why must we bend our knee to your modern age religion? And in fact, again, you say that the church and the state being in bed with each other is wrong, but yet your modern day church, your modern day religious institutions, because it's not just these companies, by the way. You have a lot of committees, right? For psychology, engineering. Everything's been invaded with these politics and this religious sentiment for egalitarianism. And they're getting money from the government, and they are effectively propaganda wings for the government. And if you step out of lockstep with them, then you get punished, and then all their lackeys sit there and they make excuses and say, well, you deserved it, you stepped out of line. And obviously, if you step out of line, there's just something wrong with you. Obviously, you're going against common sense, ethics, morals, and values. How dare you say that, for instance, just like the Bible says, that homosexuality is an abomination before God? How dare you say that? How dare you believe it? And how dare you say it shouldn't be normalized or popularized in society or culture? How dare you? How dare you have many of the, and there's a bunch of other positions that we can speak about, but to keep it short, they just say, how dare you have views outside of our own? Again, I can throw another one out, of course. The fact that men and women are different, that they're not equal. That is you falling out of lockstep with them, and then suddenly now you're evil. Even though believing in the equality of man and woman, believing that they're equal, that actually causes a lot of problems for society, but no one wants to talk about that, do they? It's so interesting how we treat corporations now as the religious leaders of today. That they are the preachers, the pastors of modernity, of modern culture. That we are not to question them. That they are the instigators of your damning to hell or your salvation to heaven. It's so interesting that they hold so much power over you existentially, even spiritually, economically, politically, culturally. Right? What kind of customs should I practice? I don't know, go to Europe. Right now they're getting invaded by a bunch of Indians who want to blast out music, Indian music, who don't want to respect European culture in, let's say, the UK, right? In many of the other countries. That's interesting that you're not allowed your own culture, but you must bend your knee to the invasive culture that is not you and does not represent you and does not speak your language. That's so interesting. Here's the reality, man. And this is the thing that we have now come to see for the longest time at this point today. The modern left is absolutely in bed with these corporations. That's for one. The modern left is mobilizing companies, the economy, to push their modern agenda, their modern religion. They are using these companies as modern day synagogues to what? The belief of egalitarianism. They are now utilizing your very own economical existence. They're using the economy to reinforce your ethics, your principles, your values, your beliefs. They're using it to control whether or not you are allowed to say something's right or wrong, vile or redemptive, right? Vile or pure. You're not allowed to say any of these things. You're not allowed to say what you're disgusted with, what you hate. Quite frankly, you're not even really allowed to say what you love, unless you're in lockstep with egalitarianism. If you are, then you are absconded of all your sins. Good on you. Now you're playing ball with their religion. But the truth is that these are modern day religious institutions being weaponized to control you, to control your beliefs, to control your ethics, to control how you go through your day-to-day life. These are modern day religious institutions completely woven by political activists, propagandists, and their entire intention is to ultimately enforce their ideological and spiritual supremacy upon you. There is to be no existence for any other rivaling belief, for as long as that rivaling belief has more power than they themselves. As long as they can transform you, deconstruct you, for as long as they can recontort you to their image, for as long as they can hijack your ethics and your values, because again, modern Christianity is now what? Modern Christianity is not modern Christianity, it is modern egalitarianism. Because here's something to say, egalitarianism is a polytheistic religion. And at the head of polytheism, for egalitarianism, the Zeus is egalitarianism, relativism is the mother of all that stems from egalitarianism. So we look at feminism, multiculturalism, socialism, the gender stuff too, go down the list. Every little facet of egalitarianism, the father of it all, of the entire body. And by the way, a part of that is modern Christianity. Modern Christianity is now a child of relativism, which of course was born out of egalitarianism. And of course, by the way, who is the father? Who is the father of egalitarianism? Who's the Kronos of it all? The Kronos of egalitarianism, which is Zeus, is Satanism in its ultimate form, fundamentally. But this is exactly what is controlling society right now. Right now, this is what so many people, they make excuses for right now. They make excuses for these businesses, these corporations to play God, to play as the pastors, to play as the man at a pulpit, speaking his message upon the masses that you have no other right but to comply. That's what we are experiencing today. We have taken faith and religion, we destroyed and we killed it, and then we replaced it with the economy. And now through the actors of the economy, now we're weaponizing it to control the masses and to ultimately subjugate their existences, their minds, and their psychology to the operant forces of egalitarian supremacy.